Welcome to the 2025 Farming Smarter Conference. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Craig Lester. I am the owner of Rural Roots Canada, and I'll be your MC over the next couple of days here. On top of owning the agricultural media and communications business, I'm the project coordinator for the Blue Book. I'm a Nuffield Canada Scholar, and I'm a volunteer with the Alberta Farm Writers Association, Canadian Farm Writers Federation, and the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists, and as well as I sit on the board for the Canadian Agribusiness Education Fund. We have an exciting couple of days planned here, jam-packed for sure. So I want to get to the schedule as quickly as possible here. A couple of notes ahead of time here. The most important, of course, is the Wi-Fi. The account is Prime Guest, and the password is Prime Lodge 2012. Prime is with a capital P. So that's Prime Lodge 2012, and Prime has a capital P. When you're posting to social media, please use the hashtag FSC25 and the handle @FarmingSmarter. And a reminder that, yes, we want you to be posting on social media and staying connected, but please turn the volume off on your cell phones during the speakers. They have some great presentations, and we want to make sure that all the speakers are respected. Washrooms are just outside the doors, the men to the left and the women to the right. And we're hoping to get to all of your questions at the end of every presentation. That's time permitting, of course. We'll be using Slido to ask questions, and you can vote for your favorite question there. The QR codes to use Slido are on your agenda, so you can scan from that. As well, continuing education credits for CCAs are available. Sign or scan the code at the registration desk to get your credit. I want to say a big thank you to our major sponsors, Equus, Down to Earth Labs, Alberta Canola, Lethbridge Herald. And backed by popular demand is once again the 4-H auction, which is graciously hosted online through Perlich Brothers and supports the Southern Region 4-H by providing much needed funding for many activities, including consumer decision making, speaking competitions, and scholarships. Auction items will start to close after the 4-H presentations tomorrow. You can pay by cash, check, Visa, MasterCard, or e-transfer. And a big thank you to all the donors who graciously donated items to this. Thank you so much for taking time to graciously donating to that. So without further ado, we'll get to our keynote speaker here. Gary Marr is an accomplished and respected leader with deep experience in government and business. Prior to joining the Canada West Foundation in 2020, Gary served as president and CEO of the Petroleum Services Association of Canada, the national trade association representing the service, supply, and manufacturing sectors within the upstream petroleum industry. He has broad experience in government and served as a member of the Legislative Assembly in the province of Alberta from 1993 to 2007. Gary has also served as the official representative of the province of Alberta at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and as the province of Alberta's representative in Asia from 2011 to 2015. So everyone, please welcome Gary to the stage.
Thanks very much. I have to say it was a beautiful drive from Calgary today, albeit an early morning, but that's what made me feel more like a farmer. So let me say this. It's very difficult to write a speech on this topic about ag policy, trade policy in a world without rules, because things are changing even as we are speaking. And I'm afraid that, when I was at the Canadian Embassy, I'm glad I'm not there now, because I would hate to be writing a briefing note and it's out of date by the time I hit send. And this is an issue in the United States. So let me start with this opening that I learned a lot of stuff when I went to the inauguration on January the 20th of 2025. And here's what I learned while I was there. I was invited by a congressman to attend the inauguration, so I went there. And I've come to this conclusion. The president doesn't care about voters. Voters have served their purpose. He's not going to rely on them again. He instead is interested in doing things, frankly, that personally enrich him. I think that what's happened in the United States is that, think about the steel and aluminum tariffs the other day, that somewhere between the time that he landed in New Orleans for the Super Bowl, and the time he attended the game, he just announced that he was going to put steel and aluminum tariffs. It caught everybody by surprise that it was effective starting Monday. And if you only had 30 minutes advance notice of what he was going to say, you'd have gone long on buying stocks that were steel and aluminum manufacturers in the United States, and you might have gone short on Canadian aluminum and steel manufacturers because of all the aluminum and steel that is used in the United States. A lot of it, a large percentage, we are by far the largest exporters of those two products to the US. And you might think about this as well. I don't know a lot about airplanes, but a lot of an airplane is made out of aluminum. So you might have shorted companies like Boeing, which use a lot of aluminum in making aircraft, or some of the defense manufacturers, fighter jets use a lot of aluminum. So I think that Mr. Trump, somewhere in the Trump universe of companies, somebody probably gets a few minutes head start notice on what he's going to say on day one, and he takes it back on day two, and you go long or go short, depending on whether it's the currency markets, or whether it's steel, or whether it's agricultural products. I'll say this also, the president isn't the sole problem of this. It is in part the United States itself. And I went back to hearing some speeches that Ronald Reagan had made, and you'll recall the kind of relationship that President Reagan had with Prime Minister Mulroney. And it was a phenomenal friendship. It was a deep one. It was a real one. And as I listened to speeches that Ronald Reagan made about Canada and its importance to the United States, Ronald Reagan would not recognize today's America, I don't think. Today's America is different for three reasons. One, it, 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 it is a culture of achievement that has been replaced with a culture of grievance. And so Donald Trump is not the reason for this. He is a symptom of this. There are all kinds of people that felt left out, that a rising tide was only lifting the yachts. And as a result of that, they voted for Donald Trump, who they believed to be an outsider who was going to change things. He hasn't, in my view. I think he's made them worse. The second thing I would say about America is that they no longer have common facts to work on. It's something different. Everybody has got their own version of facts. They've got their own brand of messages that they want to hear. And so nobody listens to Walter Cronkite in the evening news, for those of you that are old enough to remember him, or Peter Jennings, or any of those guys. And instead, people are in their own silos, listening to what they think is the truth. And the third thing is that people have very short attention spans. And whatever attention span still exists in America, it is sucked up by the tech bros who were sitting in the front row at the inauguration, along with Dana White from UFC. So, and I could, for some of you have heard me talk about Donald Trump's relationship with pro wrestling before, perhaps. In 2016, I was doing a CBC live television, and I was asked, we want you to evaluate the 16 candidates who are seeking the nomination for the Republican Party for presidential nomination. And I said, well, before I do that, I'm going to talk about pro wrestling. I know more about pro wrestling than the average guy. And I could tell that the CBC guy was a little uncomfortable, wondering where I was going with this. So I said, it's not well known that Donald Trump has been involved with pro wrestling for 30 years, mostly because his hotels and venues were used as places where such events took place. I said, it's also not well known that Vince McMahon of World Wrestling Federation, now WEF, World Entertainment, no, WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. He was the president of Stampede Wrestling in Calgary in the early 1980s. And I said, I acted for the British Bulldogs when I was a young lawyer. These guys were pretty fun. You got to say that there's as a young lawyer, these guys were always getting in trouble. They had lots of money, and I had tons of fun with them. So that was an ideal client. But I said, look, Donald Trump participated in 2011 in an event called the Battle of the Billionaires. Did anybody see this? Anybody know about this? Nobody. Okay. So he and Vince McMahon agreed to be represented in the ring by a gladiator, and the winner got to shave the head of the loser. Okay, so you can look this up on YouTube. If you look up Battle of the Billionaires, you'll see that Donald Trump's fighter is losing very badly. And Vince McMahon is sort of prancing around the outside of the ring, getting ready to shave Donald Trump's head. And what happens is Donald Trump unexpectedly bull rushes McMahon, knocks him down, and gives him the business. And out of the audience comes a guy, rips his shirt off, and underneath he's got a referee's jersey, and it's Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold rolls into the ring, and I think he takes a chair, and he whacks the referee with the chair. The referee is now lying prostrated in a semi-state of consciousness on the mat. And he helps Trump's fighter take down McMahon's fighter. Now, of course, because he's the only guy wearing a referee's jersey, he counts him 1, 2, 3, you're out. Fight's over. And if you keep watching the video of Battle of the Billionaires on YouTube, you'll see Donald Trump shaving Vince McMahon's head. And I said, I tell you all of that to tell you this. Donald Trump has learned every lesson from pro wrestling and applied it to politics in a way that we've never seen before. I said, in pro wrestling, you demean your opponents by giving them nicknames. And this is what it sounds like. Little Marco, or Lying Ted, or Crooked Hillary. In pro wrestling, you're either a hero or a heel. And if you're a hero, this is what it sounds like. America's not great, but it's not your fault. It's the fault of the Chinese and immigrants and Mexicans. And if you're a hero, you get your crowd going with chants, usually 3 or 4 words. And it sounds like this: build a wall, make America great, or lock her up. And those 3 words will have lots of sort of public policy, real public policy. But if you ask Donald Trump, what is the public policy? He couldn't tell you. He wouldn't be able to tell you. But he is a master of doing this. And maybe the last piece that I would observe about pro wrestling and Donald Trump is that in pro wrestling, if you're the hero and I'm your fan and you represent me, I will tolerate your lying. I'll tolerate your cheating. I'll tolerate all of that stuff because you're my guy. And so, in a real sense, so what I predicted was that I think that Donald Trump has has figured this out and can win the nomination for presidential nomination, but I don't think that he can win a general election. So I was half right and I was half wrong. But the point is this: I went to that inauguration. I also went to the inauguration for Barack Obama, and it was this is now my 3rd inauguration that I've attended as a guest. It is unlike any other event that I've ever seen. This most recent inauguration, and so I did come to learn a few things about what's going on in the mind of Americans and in the United States. And I would believe that, first of all the premiers are down in Washington this week. There's something called the Council of the Federation. This is all the provincial premiers meeting in Washington with people that are important. And having said that Donald Trump is not interested in voters, I think it's important, and I think the Premier has come to recognize, the Premier of Alberta has come to recognize, it will be important to talk to people who do care about getting reelected in 2 years if you're a congressman, and every third senator gets elected in 2 year cycles. So they have a 6 year term. So 1/3 of the Senate comes up for election in 2026. And so here would be an example, an ag example of the kind of approach that I would make if I were in Washington. Senator Chuck Grassley, he's from Iowa, and not very long from now, farmers are doing their crops, planting their corn in Iowa. He would be concerned about a 25% tariff on potash if it comes, because farmers aren't going to be very happy about paying more for their inputs. And so I'd be talking to Senator Grassley, who is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee is responsible for vetting all of the judges before they're appointed. And I think that, Senator Grassley should go to the president and say, you know what, these 25% tariffs on potash aren't going to work for me. But one of the big parts of the Trump agenda is to fill up the judiciary with his appointments. And so Senator Grassley and other Republicans who are on that judiciary committee should say, you know what, we don't like this, and we're going to slow walk or stall or maybe even halt some of the appointments that you want to put through the Senate Judiciary Committee, unless you take off these tariffs on the important inputs that farmers need in the state of Iowa. So I'll make these 3 observations broadly. Trade agreements are not protecting us from the malicious actions of others. That's point 1. Point 2 is these threats come not only from our closest trade partners, but those from far away as well. Doesn't matter if we're talking about the United States or China. And 3, the question is, what, if anything, have we done to protect Canadian producers? So I would say this. I recently met with the former director of the UN Food Program. And he told me that, there's very few countries in the world that are net food exporters, maybe a half a dozen. And there's a lot of countries that are, well, first of all, they're net importers, but there's a lot of them that are teetering on the edge of, and he predicted that within the next 24 months, there could be a dozen or more countries that start to experience death by starvation. And so this is the reason why I'm very optimistic that Canada can be a very important player in the world, but we have to be resilient. We have to be able to figure out not only how we access markets, but how we survive markets in this VUCA environment. Now, VUCA is a word that I learned from a colonel who was at the U.S. Military College, the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. And the trade world today is a VUCA environment. And so we need to figure out how we're going to survive in a VUCA world. I think Canadian agriculture has been resilient in the past because the fundamental thing that you have is essential for human beings, food. Nobody can do very long without it. And, in fact, I've spoken with the Chinese ambassador in Ottawa, when they were putting tariffs on stuff coming from Canada. I said, you know what? Every country in the world is just a few missed meals away from the start of a revolution. I mean, the whole Arab Spring started over the price of onions in a marketplace in Tunisia. So we have something very important. And the federal government, the current federal government, has a mission, I think, of trying to be a leader in meeting our nationally determined commitments under the Paris Accord. In other words, the federal government wants to be leaders in bringing down GHGs. And this is what resulted in a really crazy idea that we should try and reduce the amount of fertilizer by 30% by 2030. And so Canada West Foundation, we immediately put something together, and we had hundreds of farmers from all across Western Canada on a web call. And I know that we had invited people that were from the federal government and from provincial governments. Our provincial minister of agriculture spoke at it, and we said, this doesn't work. This doesn't work at all. The federal government withdrew it, but watch for it to come back again. But in my view, a Canadian government should focus on this. What is the role of Canada in the world? It's not to be a leader in GHG reductions. I mean, for our population, I mean, we're only responsible for a fraction, maybe 2% of the world's GHG emissions. If we took out and made it zero, it wouldn't make a difference because China is building roughly one coal-fired plant every week of the year. So even if we brought ours to zero, it would immediately be replaced by China in a single year. So my view is that Canada should be a leader in making the world safer, more secure, and greener. And the way we do that is with four things, four F words: food, fuel, fertilizer, forestry. And the world has demands for all that we produce in this country. And food is one of the critical, and I would also say agricultural technologies. We are leaders in this area. And we can make the world greener by, our natural gas going to places to replace coal. And that would have a dramatic reduction in the world's GHGs. And so I think actually Premier Smith has been on the right track, both in terms of how we deal with the United States and she's trying to build a relationship. And I hear premiers now talking less about sort of let's hit the Americans where it hurts on our own counter tariffs. Well, I sort of looked into some of this stuff, and people said, wow, Mitch McConnell, he's from Kentucky. Let's put a huge tariff on bourbon, and that'll hit him where it hurts. And the bourbon industry is $9 billion. Canada imports $30 million worth of bourbon a year. So I don't think Mitch McConnell is losing any sleep over $30 million worth of product in a $9 billion industry. So I think that some of these counter tariff talks, which our premiers never talked about, they're coming around to her point of view, because in an ongoing trade war of attrition, they got bigger sticks and they got more sticks than we have. And so the idea that we try and do this by diplomacy, by reaching out to those whose interests are the same as ours, is important. So I would say that, first of all, it's not clear to me what the federal government's response is going to be to all of this. And it was predictable. I mean, we should have been doing something last summer. And Canada West Foundation, Carl O'Dade, who's spoken with you before, he talked about this last summer, that we've really got to be prepared. And it won't matter if it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But the federal government seemed to have been caught off guard. And then, when these tweets come out from the president, they're reacting. They're reacting, and they're saying, well, we're going to do this and this and this and this in response to a tweet. And I'd say, well, that'd be kind of like, the coach Sirianni telling Andy Reid, here's our playbook. We know you're going to do this, and so we're giving you our playbook to tell you how we're going to reply. And all it does is cause Donald Trump to see how much deeper he can go. Um, about 40 years ago, he had a book ghostwritten called The Art of the Deal, and I bought one. It was a paperback. I bought it at a used bookstore for $3 in Calgary, and remarkably, somebody used a $5 bill for a bookmark, so I was up $2. So I thought, wow, that's a pretty good deal. But the two lessons that you learn from it are, one, Donald Trump's strategy is you can ask for the sun and the moon and the stars, and you can settle for the moon only. The second thing that you learn from the book is that he always believes that you want to put your person that you're negotiating with on their back foot. And so you throw out stuff to try and get them off balance. And I'd say he's done a pretty good job of it. But the playbook was there. We knew how he was going to approach this, but not enough people in the federal government sort of had read this or had taken it seriously. And they thought that the Mulroney Reagan perspective of we are friends, neighbors, and allies was still going to work today. It doesn't. And we've got to be a lot more clever about building the kind of deep relationships between not just Ottawa and Washington, but all across the board. Ag producers here have to be deeply embedded with their customers, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. We've got to build longer, deeper relationships between provinces and states and premiers and governors. And we've got to, 35 US states describe Canada as their number one export destination. 22 of them are red states run by Republican governors. And governors run economies. People that are in the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States don't actually run economies, but governors do. And so when our premier has been working hard to try and establish the relationships with these governors that can make a difference, and all of the governors will be meeting at the National Governors Association meetings in Washington on the I think it's on the 20th of February this year. And I've been to those meetings. I've been to the National Governors Association meetings. And this one of the things that happens there is that the governors will all meet with the new president. And so what I did when I was our representative in Washington, I said, let's have a breakfast, a stand-up breakfast uh, at the Willard Hotel. And the Willard Hotel is right across the street from the White House. And 28 of the 50 governors came by to have breakfast with us. And we were able to get our Alberta messages to these governors and say, here's why we're important to you. At the time, we were trying to move Keystone XL pipeline. And so, I made it clear that the largest importer to the United States of oil is Alberta. And today, 1 out of every 5 barrels used in the United States comes from this province. And it's odd to me that Donald Trump, during the election campaign, the only reference that he really made to Canada was that he wanted to complete Keystone XL. That pipeline is built from Hardisty all the way to the Montana border, but it's going to require somebody on the US side to say, yeah, I want to build that. But he never talked about tariffs against Canada. But it was all part of his strategy of sort of catching everybody on their back foot. And so um, I guess, we now know that tariffs are on steel and aluminum. And here's the issue for agriculture is that people in the US are treating it as if there already is a tariff. And so I was told that there was a pork producer in Ontario that was shipping a load of pigs to the US. And the buyer said, I'm taking 25% off of your price because of this tariff, and you're going to pay it. And I mean, the tariffs haven't even been put in place, but people are behaving as if it is. And so, and the other piece on that, the third piece on that, is that the United States, the Department of Agriculture, has indicated, as they have done in the past, that if there are counter tariffs, they will compensate their producers. Now, when they had their challenges with China, um, they said, okay, we're going to compensate you. They put $28 billion worth of compensation on the table. And that's not something that the Canadian government could afford to do. So, as I say, this idea of counter tariffs probably doesn't work for us because their sticks are bigger and their sticks are more numerous. I think that that communications is really important in this particular case of how it is that we survive. And I think that I have to put a challenge out to you, and I'm prepared to be part of the messenger of this. Canada West Foundation has done a lot of work in the area of trade policy, but I, I actually would want to open up to the floor here. What would farmers, what would your associations want us to work on that would be helpful to you? For sure, one of the things that's going to come up with Donald Trump is supply management, as an example. What should what should we tell the federal government that we can't just unilaterally change supply management without the involvement of of producers? But Donald Trump, he he promised dairy farmers in Wisconsin that things were going to get better for them. And tariffs is the way that he thinks he can accomplish it. So I think it's a given that supply management comes up. What should we tell the federal government should be the response? And one of the challenges always is that, you've heard Premier Ford say, well, we need to have the Team Canada approach. And it's not helpful that Danielle Smith is, on the outside of our communique. Um, I didn't think that was particularly helpful because the Team Canada approach sometimes is simply Team Central Canada approach. And the example of that would be, in order to help the auto industry in Ontario, the government puts 100% tariff on Chinese-made EVs. And how do the Chinese counter? It's on canola. So Team Central Canada sometimes casually casts off the economic interests of Western Canada. This is a pattern that I've seen for a long, long time. So uh, I'd like to say, like, if you're taking notes, my email is mar@cwf.ca. And if you have thoughts on what we can do collectively, what response should we give them? Because we are in a VUCA environment. We're in a challenging environment. And I think that, as I said, we got something really good on our hands, which is food is so important to everywhere in the world. And the world wants what we produce. But how do we get it there? How do we survive? I'm not sure that I've got all the answers, but I know that I can help convey those answers. I speak with some of the people that are on this U.S. Panel, um, which the Prime Minister set up. I noted that the guy who represents agriculture and forestry is a guy from Quebec. There's nobody from Alberta except Rachel Notley. There's nobody from the oil and gas industry on that panel. They've got union workers, union representatives, 3 from Ontario. But the guys that I speak to are Jean Charest, the former Premier of Quebec, and the former Premier of Nova Scotia, Stephen, his name escapes me now. But what should I be telling them? What should the Canadian response be from the perspective of farmers and your associations? So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have now. But if you don't have anything right now to say, please send me a note, and I'll be happy to try and put together something, and I'll share it with you when it goes off. But thank you very much. Question over here. Oh, VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And VUCA is a way that the military plans its strategy because, and this colonel that I was speaking to, who had completed a paper on VUCA, was saying that when you're in a forward operating environment like Afghanistan, it's a VUCA environment because your guys wear uniforms. You can recognize the Germans that are there. You can recognize the Dutch. You can recognize the Americans. You can recognize the Canadians. What you cannot recognize is who your enemy is. And the ground changes, alliances change. And so I think thinking of it from a VUCA perspective, it's true for what we're dealing with now in agriculture trade policy. And my email is mar@cwf.ca. I'm glad I've got an easy name to spell, not a long one. Any other questions? Right there and then over here. Okay. Hmm. Sure, sure. Um, well, in China, there is a centralized economy. I mean, having spent time there, I can tell you that probably 80% of the world's locks are built in the within 100 square mile radius of the Pearl River Delta. So it doesn't matter if it's the locks on these doors, the locks on your truck, the locks on your home, the lock on your office. The lock is probably built in China. Same thing with light bulbs. Um, most of the world's light bulbs. It doesn't matter if the manufacturer is Philips or GE or whoever. They're all built within a relatively small area. So China does have a directed economy for sure. Now, we do have trade agreements with places around the world. We've got CETA, which is the European Free Trade Agreement. We've got the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I don't think the government of Canada wants to direct, nor does the Alberta government want to direct where you go. But if you choose to go, they want to set up the structure that allows you to get in there. And so I can remember talking to some cattle guys, and I said, Indonesia is a huge market for halal beef, and they said, well, it's easier for us to ship it to Kansas City for processing. And here's the reason. Uh, I sent it to Kansas City. I, I speak English. They speak English. I can read the contract. I know how to get it there. I've had a long-standing supply agreement. If there's a problem, I can pick up the phone. If there's a big problem, I can hop on a plane and be there tomorrow. But you're telling me about this opportunity that's 12 time zones away. I don't speak the language. I'm not even sure I know what halal is. Um, I'm not sure how to get it there or read the contract or how I get paid and what I can do to solve it if it goes wrong. And I guess what I'd say is this, is that Australians have figured it out. But to your point, a lot of trade is dependent upon geography. And by reason of our geography, um, we we will always have the United States as our biggest customer. Uh, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. Like my dad had a corner grocery store. It's maybe half the size of this room. This little corner store in Calgary, and even a corner store owner would say if there's one thing better than having one really good customer, it's having two or more really good customers. And so uh, we need to, we need to think about all the other opportunities where we could go with what we make, what we produce in this country, whether it's food or anything else. How do we, how do we expand and have less reliance upon the United States, but deeper relationships with the United States, so that we can survive these changes that come up so suddenly. Um, think like a Viking. Thinking like a Viking means, like, if you think about um, the four Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, they have huge companies. They make up 0.3% of the world's population and over 1% of the world's GDP. These guys are batting it out of the park. And Sweden, which is a pretty small country, they make their own fighter jets. And that actually reminds me of the whole issue of interprovincial trade barriers should be one of the things on our agenda to deal with. But, um, Lego, the world's biggest toy maker, if you think about ship making in Denmark, if you think about IKEA, the world's biggest furniture store, and by reason of Swedish meatballs, the sixth biggest restaurant chain in the world. It's you'd have to say that Vikings, maybe I don't know. This is just a working theory of mine, but if we thought like Vikings, we wouldn't be afraid to step out into the world and take the world on, instead of being comfortably ensconced in what is a psychological security blanket called a free trade agreement with the United States. So I guess that psychological um, security blanket, Kuzma as we call it, is blinding our eyes and ears to the opportunities that exist in other places. Not that we'll ever replace the United States, not that it should ever be a directed economy, because I agree with you, that wouldn't go over well with Albertans. I get that. But it's about opening up our eyes and ears to opportunities in other parts of the world. There's a question there.
Hi, thanks, Gary, for being here and for your words. My name's Christine McKee. I'm a farmer director with Alberta Canola. I'm here today as a farmer, though. Um, I hope I have time for a couple of things. One is I've been hearing from some really wise and more experienced people than me that one thing we need is a more powerful agricultural minister federally, but that goes for all of our natural resources. All those natural resources need to have more powerful, I don't know what the word is, prestigious, influential ministers. And maybe part of the way we get that is by influencing public opinion and the populace's opinion of our natural resources and the pride that Canadians have in their natural resources. So that's one thing I think you can take back there.
Okay, so I agree with you. I mean, and you've heard Pierre Poilievre talk about this. Don't send me your high-paid corporate lobbyists. Make it important to the public. And I think if there's anything that is a silver lining from what Donald Trump's doing, maybe 20 years from now, we're going to be thanking him for some of the things, the nationalism that he's created in Canada. I've heard more about dealing with interprovincial trade barriers, the military, um, domestic, domestic industrial capacity, lowering taxes, and energy exports. I've heard more of that in the last 4 weeks than I've heard in the previous 10 years. I mean, you've got Premier Legault from Quebec. I've known him since we were both health ministers together. I heard him say, well, maybe it's time to rethink this idea of a natural gas pipeline that goes through Quebec so that we can sell it, liquefy it, sell it to our allies in Europe that are demanding this. Compare that to the Prime Minister, who, in response to Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister Kishida, the President of South Korea, the President of Poland, saying, I don't know that there's a business case. I haven't seen a business case for LNG. Well, you got four customers that have just come to you, and the first thing I'd say is, Prime Minister, that's not your job. It's the job of the private sector to determine whether or not there's a marketplace and a business case for building, LNG or pipelines or what have you. But you're right that you know there have been weak ministers who have kowtowed to the demands of a prime minister whose only focus is meeting our Paris targets, and it has resulted in bad policy being tossed out for agriculture, like the fertilizer one that I gave, but also a terrible process for trying to build infrastructure um, to be able to get what it is that we make to markets. And if you can't move it, you can't sell it. And so we need upgrades in our roads and our highways and our rail and our pipelines and our ports and our airports in order to be able to move what we make to markets around the world.
Thank you. My other question, is there time?
Yep.
I really don't mean to put you on the spot about this. This is just to get an idea out there. So I hope you don't mind. When you talked about going down to the Governors Association meeting years ago, I'm interested to know what organization were you with? And what I really want to know is if you took any farmers with you.
So at the time, I was with the government of Alberta, and I was our representative in Washington. So I got invited to speak at the NGA. So I didn't take a delegation with me, but I spoke there. And actually, what I talked about was Queen Victoria, which for Americans was a bit of a strange topic. I said, in 1898, when Queen Victoria celebrated her Jubilee, she'd been on the throne for 50 years. Um, Britannia was at its height, and everybody got the day off work on the day of her Jubilee celebration, which meant that about 20% of the world's population, representing about 25% of the world's occupied land mass, got the day off work, which is phenomenal to think about. The sun never set in the British Empire, literally. And so, after the First World War, Britain um, Britain borrowed a lot of money to conduct the First World War. The Second World War comes around, they have to borrow even more money. And when the Suez Canal crisis takes place in the 1950s, they go to their principal foreign lender, the United States, and says, we'd like to borrow more money. And the United States said, no, you owe too much money already. And the world's greatest power could no longer be the world's greatest borrower at the same time. I said, you might be wondering why I mention this, but historically, the debt to GDP ratio in the United States has been about 30%. Today, it's 60%. But on your current track, inside of 5 years, you'll exceed 100%. And at some point, if history repeats itself, the world's greatest power cannot be the world's greatest borrower at the same time. So I offer that up as a lesson from history, because I always believe that what is past is also bound to repeat itself in the future. So I didn't take any farmers with me at that time, and frankly, the key focus for me was about trying to get KXL over the line.
And my idea with that is, I've heard a few people say that, and you said, I believe earlier today, that we need to develop better relationships with people across the border, right? And so I'm starting to think about, well, how do we do that as farmers? How do we get connected with American buyers, sellers, but farmers, right? And look them in the eye and make those connections and build those relationships.
I think it's a good idea. I mean, the Alberta Forest Products Association is doing that now. I think they've gone down to I think currently about 25% of the lumber that's used in the United States is from Canada. Donald Trump says, we don't need your lumber. We got beautiful forests in Georgia, which are planted trees. They're plantations, and it's a kind of tree called a southern yellow pine. And the problem with SYP is that it's got a lot of rosin in it, and it's soft. So mills don't like using it because the sap gums up their sawing operations, and it's not grown in a cold environment where you get longer fibers. So Douglas fir that comes from British Columbia or Alberta would be a much superior product for sawyers to deal with. But they are going down to meet with home builders because lumber obviously makes up a big part of the input cost of a house. And if you look at the fires in the state of California, they're going to have to rebuild a lot of houses. And the president himself has said that he has the ambition of building 1.5 million homes. Um, and I don't think you can do it without Canadian lumber because you're not going to be able to get it from Europe. Transportation costs will make it prohibitive, and you don't have the fantastic forest that you think you have. And by the way, if you chase out all the undocumented Americans, nobody's going to be there to swing a hammer, anyways. So it's like I saw this meme the other day. Donald Trump went out to go play his course at Mar-a-Lago and said, "Where's my caddy?" And his aide says, "Well, you deported him, sir." I mean, there's just so many things that the president thinks that he can do, but can't do. So if you look at the executive orders on the day of the inauguration, he signed off on a bunch of executive orders. One of the things that he wanted to get rid of was birthright citizenship, which is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So he thinks that just by doing that, signing his name, he can change that. He can't. The courts have come back pretty clearly and said you need 2/3 majority in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and 38 of the 50 states to agree before you can change the Constitution. Doesn't matter to President Trump because there are people who will act as if it was the case. And so I spoke to somebody in Washington. They were saying that the VAs, the Veterans Affairs facilities that have a lot of undocumented Americans who are working there, they don't show up for work because they're afraid that immigration is going to scoop them up and deport them. And I've talked to people in California who've said there's nobody picking our fruit in California because they're undocumented Americans, and they're scared to show up. So I think that self-interest will result in self-correction. When Nixon put tariffs in 1971, they didn't last very long because the immediate impact on the cost to Americans was felt, and he got a lot of pressure, and I think it was about 6 months, and so I would say that the United States has some tolerance for what the president's doing, but it's not sustainable in the long run. So I think that there will be a self-correction that comes as a result of that. Yes.
One of the great things that came out of that conference gave the offering $1 a $1.75. I was sitting there, okay, I would go 80. But look, I isn't the highest. And I think one of the things coming out of that bullet board, as well as now we need to get more market outside of Canada. I look at that as being tough government going forward. I know China is U.S. for 1 and 2 exports. Most of the canola that goes in the U.S. goes in export.
Right.
Most of the canola that goes to I don't know if either one of those is pretty easy to tackle. Going across the ocean. So I guess the question really comes: how can canola growers be more focused, go with other growers, out depending on the government?
I think this is an excellent plan, and a checkoff is putting your money where your mouth is, right? So I think that that the oil that goes into the United States, I think most of it ends up being processed into renewable biodiesel. And I think the argument that we should be making, if you think about sort of Donald Trump's world of wanting to repatriate manufacturing and jobs to the U.S., you'd say, well, actually, Mr. President, we export jobs in the form of oil and gas. we export jobs in a pipeline to you because we don't refine it. The refineries and the good paying jobs that come in a refinery or an LNG plant, which happens in J.D. Vance's home state of Ohio, there's three refineries there. 100% of that oil comes from Alberta. In the Marathon refinery in Detroit, 100% of that oil comes from Alberta. And then so when Doug Ford was talking about putting an export ban, I said, well, Premier Ford, I sent him a text. I said, Premier Ford, you need to know that oil that crosses the border at Montana goes into Michigan, and then Line 5 takes it back into Ontario. So that's where your oil comes from for processing in Sarnia. And then Line 9 takes the oil further to refineries in Montreal. So if you cut off the oil at the U.S. border, you're cutting off your own oil. But canola, you'd make the same argument. You know, we provide canola oil to the U.S. They have jobs that sort of value add it and turn it into those jobs are then producing job opportunities and finished product. But that's true of tomatoes out of Leamington that go into a can of Campbell's soup. We're sending you raw materials. It's true of the auto sector. We send you parts and you finish those cars in Michigan. So we should be talking about how our interests are the same. You want to create jobs in the United States, Mr. President? We help create jobs because we provide inputs, whether it's beef, whether it's agricultural product, whether it's tomatoes, whether it's, potatoes that come out of southern Alberta, whether it's wheat that gets turned into something else in the United States. We create jobs in the United States because not all of our material that we send is in finished form. We send it as an input for the manufacturing process in the United States. So that would be the kind of argument that I'd be making. And I'd be making it not just with the president, I'd be making it with the people whose, like you say, the manufacturers in the United States. I mean, I think it's a great idea that the Alberta Forest Products Association is going down to Texas to talk with home builders because they get it. So your idea is an excellent one. If you wanted to, sort of sit down and have a cup of coffee, we should talk that out as to who the targets are in the United States. Yes.
Why is the focus on dairy so much and not on poultry?
Supply management, broadly speaking, should be looked at, not just dairy. But the reason why I mentioned dairy is because the president likes wearing a cheese head when he goes to Wisconsin. So he's got this deep relationship with farmers, apparently.
The U.S. Dairy producers are more concerned about that because they're decentralized, and the market for chicken and pork is pretty much oligopoly in the U.S. as well. But there's also a significantly high tariff on a cheese at 287%. That's kind of a poke in the eye to them as well.
Yeah.
And I think our profitable processors are taking advantage of the market in the U.S. as well, which is part of the problem.
Yep.
The second one I wanted to ask you about is you alluded to cleaning up our own house a little bit with interprovincial trade barriers. What's the hope for that?
Well, it's not an easy one, but, if I were here in Lethbridge, I probably know something about a market in Great Falls, Montana, but I don't know anything about the market in, Sudbury, Ontario. And the whole issue of interprovincial trade barriers was probably best exemplified back in 2005. I don't know how many of you remember the Hay West program, but there was a drought that was going on here, and farmers that had hay, were moving it to places where they didn't have hay. And in northeastern British Columbia, I can't remember the exact year, it was 04 or 05, they had a drought in northeastern BC, and Premier Klein hopped on board this idea of Hay West, which was, forgive me the pun, but a grassroots movement to help people move stuff there. And here was the issue. It was about transportation regulations. And now I'm not a trucker, but there's something called a head rack. And so you could stack your load in a way that satisfied the Alberta transportation regulations, or you can load your hay in a way that satisfied the British Columbia regulations, but they didn't match. And so DOT guys at the border between British Columbia and Alberta were trying to stop Alberta trucks that had hay to go to farmers because they didn't have a head rack on the truck. And I guess the head rack, the purpose of it is to keep your stacks of hay from blowing off the top of the load on the trailer. But as an international trading protocol, you can move your truck from Alberta to Montana and Montana to Idaho and Idaho to British Columbia, because the international protocol is if it meets the regulations of the point of origin of the load, then it's good to cross borders. Ralph Klein said, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. He says it's easier to move it across to the international border twice and an interstate border. That's easier to do than shipping it from Alberta to BC. And so that's when he and Gord Campbell got together with something called TILMA, which was the Trade Investment Labor Mobility Agreement. And it was trying to bring down some of these interprovincial barriers. It's a long time coming. We have a Canadian, agreement on internal trade. It's got no teeth. And so, if you tried to sell, I don't know, something like colored margarine to Quebec, they'd say, no, can't bring it here. And it's contrary to their obligations under the internal trade agreement, but because there's no teeth, there's no enforcement mechanism, you still have to sell margarine in a white tub with a yellow envelope package, and you mix the coloring in, and then it kind of looks like butter. But I don't think anybody's mistaken between butter and margarine. Those are the kinds of things that are costing Canadians money. The estimates that I've seen from economists is that costs about $200 billion a year, which is roughly, somewhere between a 4 and 8% change in the GDP. We'd be wealthier if we were able to move things across interprovincial borders more easily and bring down those barriers. So is it easy to do? It's not going to be easy to do, but I think it's important that we try and take a shot at it. Thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Marr, for that, and very insightful. It's very clear that we're all hungry for insight given the changing situation there. And I know there's probably still more questions out there. As Gary is mentioning, his email address is marr@cwf.ca.